Okay guys, welcome back to Miss Bruce's YouTube channel, and I'm going to read Raw by Scott Monk for some students that struggle to get through this book. If you're one of those kids, come and see me. I will let you know. Okay, is that bright enough? Is that better light? Just want it to be able to read. Okay, let's get going. I haven't done this in a while. Not since last year, so bear with me. Prologue. Busted. Brett panicked. He snatched the loot from the cash register as the darkness of the bottle shop exploded with the red and blue lights of a police car wailing down the street. He stuffed anything he could, coins, notes, smokes, into his pockets and then groped blindly behind him. Smash! Half the shelf stock scattered onto the floor. He swore. All that alcohol gone to waste. If he hadn't tripped the alarm, he might have scored some big bucks for all that. Forget it. He grabbed 3 bottles and then ran to the back door. Locked. He shook it madly, but it wouldn't move. The siren grew louder and louder, and as he picked at the door with fumbling fingers, he then triumphantly yanked it open with an angry boom. He lost 1 bottle in the attempt, but he got what he came for. Brett jumped off the landing into the laneway. He ran east thinking it was safe. Wrong. The pigs. The patrol car skidded into the dark laneway, wild and mean. Its headlights snarled. Brett and he dropped the last 2 bottles to leap for the fence. With a grunt, he pulled himself up and over as the police braked underneath him. Voices started shouting, but Brett was gone. He darted down a garden path, a dog yapping at his heels. A house light blinked on, but it was too late. Up and over another fence and he was free, or so he thought. The cops pounced. The driver gunned the car from an adjoining street and crashed over a corner to hunt the 16-year-old down. Tires squealed as Brett and the pigs both raced along the road. A second later, the teenager's lead came to an end. The car attacked, swinging left to cut him off. Too predictable. Brett leapt onto the bonnet and landed on the other side, screaming. The cop driving it hit the horn as Brett sprinted away to the safety of a nearby park. The patrol car sped along the empty street, the park trees barring it from chasing Brett further. Its radio was loud and scrambled like the thoughts running through his head. Was that? Yes, another siren screamed from south. If the cops weren't mad before, boy, they were now. He bolted through the playground and past the swings, looked for a way out. On his left was a shop wall. On the right, the cops. No good. He charged forward to jump another fence instead. The drop was too deep. His ankle gave way and he tumbled to the uneven ground. He knew he was in trouble the second he hit. He tried to stand but screamed in pain. His bones felt like they'd been ripped from their skin. Nursing his leg, he knew it was useless. There was no way he'd escape now. Car doors slammed shut and the cops rushed from everywhere. They caught him with their torches hiding behind the shed. He made one last hobble for safety, but the pigs grabbed him and threw him hard against the wall. Don't move, they shouted, grabbing their guns forward, or you're dead. Chapter 1. Bang! Startled, Brett jolted awake. He clutched his stomach, expecting to find a bullet, but he found he was still alive. The pain in his ankle had gone, but his ears throbbed with the echo of what sounded like gunshot. He blinked back sleep and looked around. A cloud of thin black smoke trailed the rattly paddy wagon. A backfire. A stupid little backfire had scared him. He felt relieved, collapsed against the jagged squares of the metal cage and swallowed. He'd survived, but for how long? It was at least 40 degrees inside the wagon. His throat was dry and his face, back and shirt and jeans were swamped with sweat. The black canvas covered cage trapped the heat blazing outside. There were no windows and only a peephole on each side of the door. Brett desperately needed some fresh air and a drink soon. Asking the cops up front in their air-conditioned cabin was hopeless. They'd already said no twice. He rolled his eyes to the left and stared out of the peepholes. Nothing had changed. All he saw was the endless dirt road that kept rolling on, shutting them again. He didn't know where he was and he didn't want to. He'd given up trying to find out hours ago when he realised one unknown town was as unknown as the next. This was the 10th hour on the road now, and he and the two cops had set out from Sydney at 4 in the morning to avoid the midday heat, but a blowout in the middle of Nowheresville had cost them that lead. The pigs had forgotten to bring a spare wheel, and one of them had to thumb a ride back into the nearest town to find a mechanic. There hadn't been a house or a farm in sight. It was the only time he'd been let out of his cage the whole trip. Oh sure, the cops had stopped to buy drinks or food or go to the dunnies along the way, but not him. He had to stay in the cage for everyone to gawk at. The blowout had saved him though. Standing by the road after a much needed leak, he smoked his first cigarette for the day and drank selfishly from the remaining cop's water bottle. The pig had given to him not out of sympathy but out of necessity. He didn't want to spend hours filling out forms about a dead kid. Brett was hanging for a cancer stick, even though it was 40 degrees. He wanted that one last freedom. The cops took his pack of 16 shortly after they'd busted him for that break and enter, and only gave it back after the trial. The pack was now in his bag, and his bag was in the custody of the cops up front. He'd get his gear only when they reached their destination, the farm. It sounded like a pushover, just old MacDonald and a couple of geese. It didn't have the kind of threatening name other juvenile detention centres had, but its name was all that. Brett knew about where he was headed. That, and it being west of Mungadai, a country town split in half by the Queensland and New South Wales border, 800 to 900 kilometres from home. Like every juvenile detention centre, it aimed to turn troublemakers like himself into model citizens. Brett snorted, as if the farm was to be his new home for the next 3 months, thanks to his trial, which had gone badly. He was expecting the worst community service or an 8 o'clock. He was expecting the worst community service or an 8 o'clock curfew. The courts in the past had always been soft on him and let him off with a warning. We forgive you, Brett. Run along and be a good boy, but not this time. The Children's Court had a new magistrate. She flipped through the page after page of Brett Anthony Dalton's rap sheet, then given him the longest lecture of his life, and when she'd finished, he'd thought that that was going to be it. But apparently the magistrate didn't like his sincerity and sentenced him to 3 months at this farm. Make no mistakes, Brett, she warned, before the cops dragged him out the back into a holding cell. This is your last chance. If you end up in another court, it's jail. His mum and dad said goodbye before he left. They'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom watching everything in familiar silence. He wished they hadn't. He was kind of angry that they'd shown up after the trial. They didn't say much either, just take care and phone us. His mum didn't even cry. His dad was angry, of course. The old man always had that stony look on his face that hid his disappointment. Bye was more than Brett expected him to say. Brett wiped the sweat off his face and tried not to think of home. It was hundreds of kilometres away now. He wouldn't be going back any time soon. He tried to think of pools and beaches and icy drinks, anything to wash away this heat. He got his first look at Mungadai about 2:30. It was worse than he'd expected. A small town of less than 1,000 people. It had died about 20 years ago, but no one had told the locals. The main street was stretched with about a dozen verandahed shops, while the rest were lined with scores of raised single-storey houses capped with corrugated roofs. A handful of couples and farmers travelled past in their dusty utes, trucks and station wagons, but not in any rush. A teenage mother and father pushed their child along a footpath in a stroller. The only young people Brett could spot to the right, 2 lost travellers looking over the bank of a twisted river called Barwon that marked the state border before their friend came back with the right directions. Having arrived, Brett now understood why he'd been sent here. His life was to be sucked out of him, just like the towns had. After an impromptu U-turn, the wagon roared and along an empty road. 20 minutes later, the cops indicated left, and Brett lunged over to the opposite side of the cage to peek through a small hole in the black canvas. A makeshift road worn away by car and truck tyres over many years. twisted a good 2 kilometres past fenced paddocks, and before it ended at the farm. The uninspiring sight was far from the prison he'd imagined. He was expecting at least a concentration camp patrolled by Dobermans and gun-toting guards. It was, however, a little more than a large country house. At the end of the driveway, a Federation-style homestead occupied the centre of the property. Behind it was a bigger, squarish U-shaped building made of concrete. About 200 metres away was a large corrugated iron shed, radio tower, wooden stable, and the timber skeleton of a new building under construction. Next to these was an oval stockyard ringed by a fence of stripped tree trunks, with 10 or so men in jeans, dusty shirts, boots, and big broad hats, unloaded a stubborn brumby from a horse trailer. Further outwards was a playing field with a cricket pitch in the middle and football goalposts on either end, and surrounding everything there were paddocks filled with horses and cattle standing under gumps. Brett's heart beat faster as the wagon slowed to a stop. The cabin's door slammed shut and he heard voices. He tried to check out who they belonged to. The cops and 2 others, a man and a woman. The man looked like an old cowboy, or one of those guys who used to go droving cattle. A stockman, Brett thought they were called. His blue check shirt and shabby jeans, almost faded white and smeared with dirt and engine oil, hid a robust figure despite his age. A brown moustache drooped from his top lip, and a beat-up hat kept his wrinkled face shadowed from the sun. He was about 3 centimetres shorter than Brett at 170 centimetres and aged in his 50s. He didn't smile. The woman did, though, wired with grey, copper hair curled over her shoulders of a green dress. Her face was relaxed and smooth and friendly, unlike the man's. She also was in her 50s, but nowhere near as sun-dried as him. She was 160 and slightly overweight. She was the first to shake hands with the police officer, who politely took off their hats. "G'day, Mary, Sam," the senior constable Gallagher said. "Great day for a storm." "Pity there's not one due for another couple of weeks," the old stockman said in a rough voice, lifting his hat and wiping his brow as if the mere mention of the weather brought on a sweat. "Mary, Sam," the second cop, Constable Nelson, repeated. "How are you today?" "Fine, thank you," Mary said. "I thought you blokes must have decided to look after the new boy yourself when you didn't arrive on time." Brett was no boy, he was 16. "Yeah, we had a blowout near Narrabri. Pete, he had to pitch back into town and find us a spare. So how is the boy?" "He's caused a bit of trouble at the beginning, but we sorted him out. If it's okay to you, we'll hand him over and head back home." "You're going already?" Mary asked. "Afraid so. Constable Nelson and I have to be in court tomorrow afternoon. You can't drive from Sydney to Mungandai and back in one day. We'll stop at a hotel along the way, then finish the rest of the trip first thing in the morning." "Nonsense. You're not going anywhere until you've at least had some lunch." The cops turned to each other and grinned. Cops and food went together like pigs and slop, Brett snorted. "Mary, show Constable Nelson inside," Sam said. "I'll be in a minute with Constable Gallagher and the boy." The group split in 2. Senior Constable Gallagher and the old stockman walked back to the back of the wagon, as the others disappeared into the homestead. Brett slid to the front of the cage. There was no way he was going to leave it without a fight. The bolt was thrown aside and the door pulled open. Sunlight filled the cage and Brett covered his eyes. The 2 men waited for him to clamber out, but he didn't move. It was his final defiance. He wanted to go home. "Come on, Dalton, out you get," the cop said, palming sweat from his chin. Brett sat still. "Move it," the constable repeated, for what was obviously the final time. Again, Brett didn't move. Gallagher looked at Sam and then sighed. He reached forward to haul Brett out, but the stockman stopped him. The old man removed his hat, cleared his throat and said, "G'day, Brett. I'm Sam," and offered a leathery handshake. Brett looked at the man's hand and rolled his eyes. "Nice try, but no takers, Grandad." Sam pocketed his welcome, then tried another approach. "You're hungry, Brett. My wife, Mary, has lunch ready inside if you want some." Brett did, but he kept quiet. "Sorry to hear it," the stockman said, as a joke. Brett was sure He then turned to Gallagher and said, "Looks like it's only 4 of us then. You'd better lock the door, constable." Gallagher shook his head and waited until Sam was right out of the way before closing it. The cage was shrouded with hot blackness again, and Brett was alone. He swallowed long and dry, and then his stomach began to rumble. "Wait," he called out. "I've changed my mind." The door swung open and Sam and Gallagher looked inside. The constable grabbed Brett this time and growled, "No more fooling round." Brett sauntered towards the homestead, his bag shouldered by the cop. His feet sizzled with pain on the hot gravel, and the heat wave, thick and heavy, knocked him about. He didn't know which was worse, the cage, the weather, or the flies. A zillion of them sent sweaty flesh and made a mad rush for his face. Sam led the way. "Are cuffs still necessary, constable?" he asked. "Definitely. The last cop took them off at one of these places. The prisoner stole his van, and because I'm not keen on walking back to Sydney, they'll stay on the boy until Constable Nelson and I are ready to go." Brett shot Gallagher an angry stare, but the cop ignored it. Dragging his feet up the front steps, he followed Sam inside. Immediately, the cool swishing of the ceiling fan left him dumbstruck. He stood in the entrance unwilling to move, and he wasn't the only one. 2 cattle dogs, a blue and grey, sat on the floor, their sad eyes staring upwards, pale pink tongues panting and tails occasionally thumping. "Hurry up, Dalton," Gallagher growled again, closing the screen door behind him. Brett shuffled forward a few steps, and the trio continued from the living room down a hallway and towards the kitchen. The homestead was Sam and Mary's house. It had that lived-in feel. Trinkets lined the windows and shelves, well-worn chairs dressed with doilies sat in the lounge room. A half-finished crossword in a woman's magazine lay open on the coffee table next to several empty teacups. A radio chattered to itself in the kitchen, and a row of boots and shoes were tucked underneath a double bed made with only a sheet. There wasn't anything worth pinching. Brett had looked. The clock on the mantelpiece and the radio were worth a few bucks, but that was all. There was no TV or video, which was strange. Apart from counting sheep and pushing over sleeping cows, he couldn't imagine there was much to do in a forgotten town like this one. The trio entered the kitchen, where Constable Nelson was helping Mary lay out some food on a small round dinner table. 5 places were set, including one for Brett. Tall glasses of water waited for everybody, and he nearly charged for one. He sculled the water in one hit before pouring a second and a third. The cool liquid spread throughout his body and his side. The meal was simple but appreciated too. Brett was allowed to help himself to anything on the table while the others small-talked. Cold Devon and tomato sandwiches, fresh coleslaw and buttered pikelets, sure beat the dry spuds, greasy gravy, and small strips of grizzly lamb the cops had been at the city lockup had been feeding him. He wolfed everything down, certain that this would be his last good meal before the beans came out. "So why did they send you up here, Brett?" Mary asked suddenly. Leaning over his plate mid-bite, he looked up and saw everyone staring at him. Senior Constable Gallagher elbowed him in the ribs and said, "Answer the lady." Because they reckon I broke into a bottle shop," he replied, glaring at the cop. "Reckon," Gallagher snorted. "A patrol found him with his hands and pockets full before he did a runner. And it wasn't the first time either, was it?" The cop elbowed Brett again. The 16-year-old's handcuffs rattled under the table as he clenched his fists. "No. This one's well known to us," Constable Nelson added. "The whole station's been hoping to put him away for a while now. But you know what the courts are like. They're not interested in putting them away until they turn 18. "Do you have any parents, Brett?" Mary asked. "Yeah, 2, Gallagher answered. "They split up a couple of years ago, but sorted things through recently. They're good people, but they can't handle this one. He runs with a bad crowd, half of whom you'll get to meet sooner or later." Sam broke his silence. "Do you still go to school?" "Yeah, he did, but..." "Brett," the old man pushed, silencing Gallagher. Brett looked at the cop, then said, "No," he said. "Any reason why?" "I hated it." "Why is that?" "Was it the other kids?" "No." "The work?" "No." "How about the teachers?" "What do you think?" "Do you have a job?" "No." Have you been offered one?" "No." "Do you know what you want to do?" He shrugged. "Anything that pays a lot of money." Gallagher snorted. Don't they all? No-hopers like this one will never get a job because I don't think you should be calling Brett a no-hoper. They're always in places like this one. Brett swallowed the last bite and then pushed his plate away. I've had enough, he said, and he didn't mean the food. So have we, Gallagher added, taking the opportunity to leave. We'd better be off. Then rising from their chairs, the cops thanked Sam and Mary for lunch. Again, "You sure you won't stay?" Mary asked. The pig glanced at Brett with a grin. "We're sure. You'll have your hands full anyway looking after the boy." He chuckled quickly through his snout before he and the Constable Nelson followed Mary to the front door. Brett sat in the kitchen until Sam encouraged him to see the police off too. "Bye," the cop said, waving. "Wait," Sam called out just as they settled back into the wagon. "You'd better unlock these." He lifted Brett's handcuffs for the officer to see. They looked at each other and then laughed before Senior Constable Gallagher walked back up to the steps. "We were hoping you wouldn't notice," he joked. "All the same, take them off, please." Sam's moustache rolled over his lip, hiding an unamused frown. The cop looked up and lost his smug grin when he didn't find it mirrored. With a twist, he unlocked the handcuffs and snapped them back onto his belt. Blood rushed back into Brett's wrists and he cracked them backwards and forwards to get the stiffness out. "We'll see you round, Gallagher." Not so friendly this time. "You too, Dalton. In 3 months, I reckon." Then dipped his cap. Mary, from the veranda, Sam, Mary and Brett watched the wagon disappear, back towards the main road. Finally Sam turned to Brett and said, "Come on, I'll show you around the property." And that's the end of chapter 1.